Nightmare. Written and read by Joshua Todd Basener. It was the latter half of the reign of Queen Victoria, in a time when something so absurd as the sun rising the next day could happen, but never something so absurd as a man rising from the dead, that a professor in human psychology by the name of John Lewis Strauss made his abode in an often romanticized city looked down upon by the heights of Elizabeth Tower that many know full well as the City of London. It was here that Strauss worked by the light of the bay windows behind his lawn desk, cataloguing various psychiatric disorders and categorizing various maniacs. The problem of madmen at the time was one that was efficiently dealt with by means of these cozy institutions known as asylums. Fortunately for any potential inmates, however, Strauss's cozy fireplace-lit office served as a step in the path to a future spent in Hanwell and, in some cases, even a gateway to a path leading to a future spent at home. He was, in fact, what could be called a psychiatrist. He had a number of rather pathetic cases walk through that oak door at the other end of his room, but there was never any as peculiar as the day when he was entreated to the saddest case of them all. For this was the case of a man whom he had known for years now. Not personally by any means, for the man was rarely known to step foot out of his wealthy flat except for zoological expeditions. But rather, Strauss knew this man by having read a number of his books addressing the implications and evidence of a new-fangled idea known as evolution. The door at the room's end opened a crack, and his secretary poked her chestnut lock-framed head in. Her youthful face glanced nervously to his desk as he looked up slowly and adjusted his spectacles. "Dr. Strauss, the police have come in with a man afflicted by a case of paranoia. They say you can help." Strauss looked back down to his papers to casually continue writing. "What's the poor man's name?" "His name? It's Dr. Taylor. Benjamin Horace Taylor." Strauss's pen froze in its course as his eyes shot up to her nervous face. Benjamin Taylor? The very same Benjamin Taylor who recently published his thesis on the implications of the Middle Eastern archaeological findings? Yes, the same Dr. Taylor. He is said to have been entirely out of touch with every last family member or zoologist since the thesis was published. The thing's not so odd for him, but after all this silence, he has suddenly run out into the streets screaming about some kind of imminent danger. The police had him restrained and argued long with him before finally letting him be brought here." Strauss set his pen aside and gave a concerned sigh. "See to it that you do not tarry. Bring him up." The damsel nodded and disappeared, the door clicking closed in her wake. During the short duration in which his room remained vacant of all but him, Strauss set himself to returning the stout stack of books and papers across his desk to their rightful drawers. Almost instantly after he had finished this task and scooted his chair forward, the doorknob across the room clicked. Strauss set his fingers into a temple and pulled his shoulders back as the door squeaked open cautiously. What any ordinary person tends to expect when a door squeaks open is for the door to next serve its purpose in that somebody walks through it. This was, for a moment, what Strauss had expected, up until the point that the door froze on its opening trajectory and was rather froze in a crack as if its opener had silently dropped dead. Not a murmur resounded from beyond that oak door. Strauss, unable to see past the half-open oaken obstruction, was forced to call out gently, his voice sounding as if he were talking to an old friend. "Dr. Taylor, you may come in if you would like." At this a head jerked out through the crack, with the suddenness of a lightning bolt flashing through the sky. This head stared with wide eyes across the parlor-sized room. Nothing was half so pulling on a man's sense of curious pity than watching a perfectly comfortable and inviting room be surveyed by a pair of paranoid eyes. Perhaps those eyes suspected the dormant fireplace to the left would be the escape route for an assassin. Perhaps they wondered if the pine-green rug or the overhead lights were rigged to give way. One can only guess when it comes to a madman's eyes. Regardless, they finished their paranoid surveyal, and, at long last, rested upon the feature of the room that seemed to give them the most relief to their suspicion. Strauss gazed back at the eyes that were to him glued. The psychiatrist nodded invitingly. At this, the nervous eyes gave an unconvinced blink before finally using the brain to which they belonged to reach the conclusion that the room was at least safe to stand in. The door that had once served only a fraction of its purpose in being opened a fraction was pushed slowly ajar, and out of the frame stepped the most horrid mess of natural forces that Strauss had ever seen in his lifetime. The main component of his horror was not that the face was so horridly insane, or that the posture was so horridly civilized, but that these two horrific elements were combined into one figure to make a mixture more disturbing than a succession of second harmonic intervals. Strauss had seen, on a number of newspaper illustrations and what not, a picture of distinguished naturalist by the name of Dr. B. H. Taylor, which evoked in him a respect for the well-trimmed, fitly clothed gentleman gazing back. To look to his doorway and see standing there a terrified creature that had possessed the body of this unshakable intellectual filled Strauss with a disgust at the pure enigma on the threshold. The once trimmed hair now fell about the sides of the man's face like gnarled vines of a willow. The once thoughtful eyes were now wide and blood red like a foreboding sunrise. The once smooth face below those eyes was now drooping with bags like a dead tree's corpse. All of these grotesque figures were no doubt the well-earned reward of Lord knows how many sleepless nights spent trembling like a petrified dog. The face which had been so thoroughly painted by such obscene grotesqueries was mounted on a pedestal of a lean body, around which clung a long dark green frock coat. This garment clung about his ashen waistcoat like moss on a dead tree, a feature which was to the effect that when the paranoid man shivered, it seemed almost like he was a wooden corpse caught in a harvest gale. Strauss simply nodded to the topper and cane that were clutched in his guest's two gloved hands. Please, take off your coat. At this, Strauss was shocked to find that the terrified intellectual widened his eyes so that their bloodshot surface seemed to make his face glow red as he held his cane and his hat closer to his chest as if those were his sword and shield against any threat of this chaotic world. When now the learned man spoke, his voice was as enigmatic a combination of intellectual dignity and irrational paranoia as ever was his appearance. "Oh, no, Dr. Strauss, I never. Well, what if no, I simply cannot." Strauss disciplined his careful and gentle hair as he responded. "Well, why not?" The maniac glanced about the room a moment before being frozen, looking over his shoulder. Then, after the short spell of searching was complete, he threw the door closed and stood with his back to it as if it were his last stand. "I suppose you can be told. I have, in my coat, an American revolver." The realization that one is unarmed and across a confiding room with a raving maniac who was carrying a gun had, as it can be imagined, its expectedly terrifying effect on good Dr. Strauss. Although he was skilled with retaining his gentle demeanor, Strauss could not deny that he had to force back any look of astonishment from running its natural course. Instead, he simply cocked his head as if carrying a weapon was a matter of ordinary curiosity. "Well, why exactly do you think that is necessary? Are you afraid you're in danger?" "Dr. Strauss, I am most certainly in danger." "In danger of what, might I ask?" The paranoiac glanced around before finally locking eyes. "A monster. It has been haunting me." Strauss could not refuse a moment to perceive his astonishment. How could such an intellectual and naturalistic mind as this be led to believe in monsters? "Dr. Taylor, would you care to come over here and tell me about this monster? How did you come to believe it was haunting you?" At this the naturalist inched cautiously forward, glancing about him as if the wrong step could trigger an explosive. "Dr. Strauss, would you call yourself a man of science? That is to say, would you say that you only believe that which can be detected with the five senses?" "I would indeed, Dr. Taylor." "Dr. Strauss, I am a fellow man of science. Which means that I only believe in something if I can detect it through scientific means. That is to say, if I can detect it with my five senses." "That you are, kind sir. And right now, Dr. Strauss, my five senses have led me to believe undeniably in the presence of a monster." Now the naturalist had crossed the room, and was a few seconds away from the empty chair before Strauss's desk. "A monster, kind sir." "Yes, Dr. Strauss, a monster, Dr. Strauss. It has been tormenting me in my sleep. I see. That would explain why the man looked so utterly sleep-deprived. At last, this sleep-deprived man heaved a sigh as he set himself gently into the chair. Dr. Strauss, I cannot go to bed without seeing this monster. It started coming to me after I visited Egypt. Well, tell me, what exactly does the monster look like? Oh, I can't tell you. It'd be too horrible. You do not have to worry. It is always easier on the mind when she tells someone. Taylor sighed. Very well. The monster is terrifying. It is the size of the sky itself. It has 4 legs, but walks often like a biped. It has a face like an ape or some kind of savage human with razor-sharp teeth. But its color is the worst. In all my years of life, I've never seen something so unnatural as its color. Taylor shook. Strauss leaned forward. Well, what color was it? Taylor stared with wide eyes, his voice made dead serious. Bright pink with green polka dots. As can be imagined, Dr. Strauss was rather taken aback by the description of the beast. Very rarely did such odd hues invoke such fear. A man might be afraid of a bear because he knew full well that it was terrifying, but very rarely does a man fear a pink blob, primarily on account that such a notion would be too perplexing to be terrifying. I am sorry, Dr. Taylor. Did you say the beast was pink? Oh yes, Dr. Strauss, the most horrifying shade. Sometimes it's even bright green with pink polka dots. Oh, it is the most horrific thing, Dr. Strauss. Calm yourself now, Taylor. You are still safe here. You say you encounter this monster in your sleep. Can you inform me what exactly the experience is like? Taylor shook as his voice continued. Oh, the beast is horrific. Every instant when I am falling asleep, I am suddenly awakened by its roar. When I awake, I am sometimes in my bedchambers, but often I have appeared somewhere entirely elsewhere. I have often met it in the plains of Africa. I sometimes see it on the deck of a ship. I even once saw it in Paris. Have the beasts ever done you any harm? It has done me harm enough, Dr. Strauss. Every time I see it, I turn to run, but it grabs me in its awful claws, and it smashes me against the ground or brings me to its mouth. But every time, the moment just before it killed me, it instantly brings me all the way back to my bedchambers, and I leap up screaming, Oh, Dr. Strauss, it is such a horror! And have you only ever seen it while you were sleeping? That is the horror of it. I've only ever seen it when I go to sleep, which is why I have been trying not to sleep. But I have absolutely no conclusive scientific proof that I cannot also encounter the thing when I am fully awake. I might not expect it, but I never have expected it before I started seeing it, Dr. Strauss. Strauss leaned back, utterly unsure how exactly he should approach the subject. This was, no doubt, exactly the same Dr. Taylor he had so long read about. Were he talking to that man, he would have raised the obvious, reasonable truth. But to do so now felt as mad a proposition as fearing a nightmare. At last, however, Dr. Strauss relented. Kind Dr. Taylor, might I make a suggestion? Whatever could you suggest right now? Has it ever occurred to you, now you must forgive me if I offend you, but has it ever occurred to you that you might be dreaming? Taylor seemed entirely incapable of understanding his words. He cocked his nervous head. Dreaming what? Dreaming, dreaming the beast. That is to say that the beast does not actually exist, and it is all a dream. Now, as Taylor responded, a notable fire of annoyance had his voice gripped. And what exactly do you mean by dreaming? I'm sorry. I know the terror is very real. Have you ever considered that the terror is nothing more than just terror? That this beast is just just an illusion? Why exactly do you think it might be an illusion? Well, excuse me for being rash, but have you ever heard of anyone else talking about this beast? Absolutely not. And have you ever actually found the damage that the beast caused you, besides any emotional damage, remained after you arrived in your bedchambers? Well, no. Then perhaps the monster that is causing the damage is only as temporary as the damage. At this, Taylor froze, caught sore, silent as still stone. Strauss's words seemed to knock him off every last course of speech and thought. When finally the naturalist returned to his course, he returned violently. He shook the table with an enraged pound of his fist as he filled the room with a shout. Damn it, Dr. Strauss! Do you even have a clue of the implications of what you say? My five senses have told me that this monster is real. The physical damage it inflicts may be temporary as its attacks, but are not many other things that we detect with our five senses also temporary? Is not the sensation of pleasure as temporary as that which pleases us? Is not the sensation of pain as temporary as the wound? By God, is not the sensation of sensation as temporary as life? Tell me, respectable Dr. Strauss, are any of those things therefore dreams merely because they end? By your logic, all of life can end up being a dream for all we know. Please, kind Dr. Taylor, let not yourself be enraged. I am not trying to off your intellect by any means. But do you not see that every time you encounter this monster, everything seems inconsistent? For instance, you wake up in exactly different places each time you see it, receive entirely different wounds, and experience all differences. But when you wake up, you are always in the same room. You are a man of science. Science is all about things being repeated in us, assuming they will always repeat as we observe it, is it not? When an experiment falls out of line, what do we say? We call it experimental error. It is an error of sensation. What if the fact that this monster falls out of line with the rest of your sensation serves merely to mean that every time you see this monster it is nothing more than experimental error? I could just as soon say that it is experimental error for me to wake up on the wrong side of the covers. I could just as soon say that I am delirious when I hear unexpected news. If I can only trust my senses when they are telling me that which is consistent with what they have told me, then can I really trust anything? No, please do not misunderstand me. It is not that your dreams are inconsistent and hogwash. I understand you full well. You are telling me that I am insane. That is what you are telling me. Humbug! My five senses tell me it is true. What would they be if they were to carry out your logic? All the world would be a lie, that's what. Why should I only trust my five senses when they tell me what I want them to? Strauss at this point had not realized it, but what Dr. Taylor was spouting out was beginning to grow in him a deep-seated discomforting doubt. He had replied no longer as a psychiatrist, but as a philosopher trying to shake off his doubt. Dr. Taylor, understand the implications of what you are saying. Thousands of people all across the world say they sense things that are raving madness, and you. But I am what, Dr. Strauss? And I am trying to validate their senses? Very well then. Maybe you're right and they are all raving madmen. Maybe you're raving madmen too, who's just delirious of every last thing you see. And I, Dr. Strauss, am the only sane man in the world, for I am the only one whose senses I can trust. I am trusting my five senses, Dr. Strauss. What fault is in that? No, look where it has gotten you. Do not simply trust your senses. That's logic as well, and logic tells you logic right now is giving me no reason to think this monster doesn't exist. Dr. Taylor, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I do not believe something without reason, and if I do not have reason to believe something, I cannot believe it. I have all the reason I need to believe this monster is coming for me. Why or how I can never conjecture, but I have reason enough. But, Dr. Strauss, I have absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that this monster is simply a dream. Just because none else have seen it is by no means conclusive proof that it does not exist. Is truth based on a majority, Dr. Strauss? Am I right only when I agree with everyone else? If I am in a room of blind men, and none of them can see the tiger on the room's other end, does that not mean that the tiger exists? Answer me this, Dr. Strauss. Taylor stood up in his chair and gripped his cane as if prepared to attack. Strauss startled before sitting entirely still, staring into the sweaty red face of that maniac. Strauss heard his heart hammering in his ear as the man standing frozen before him heaved every breath. Please, forgive me, Dr. Taylor. Strauss placed his temple in his hands. I am merely in denial. What if you're wrong, Dr. Taylor? Taylor's voice returned coolly and menacingly. And what if I am? What if you're wrong, Dr. Strauss? What if we're all wrong? Beg pardon, I do not understand. What if all our senses are lying to us? What if all this life is a dream, as you suggest, and every last emotion we feel is but a fickle reaction to what our senses tell us we perceive? What if everything around you, from the seat you're sitting on to the man you're talking to, is a dream from which you might awake at any moment? What if your own memories are a lie? What then, Dr. Strauss? We're all evolved from animals, anyways. It should make sense that we were often just as foolish as them. Dr. Taylor, please do not entertain such an idea. You have no reason to think that. It will only make you feel worse. Taylor's brow furrowed. He held his chest out, and for the first time today, in some macabre, twisted way, the madman looked somehow honorable. I can either trust all my senses or none of them. If I have even an inkling to doubt one, what kind of a man am I? I'm either a naturalist, or I am nothing. Strauss sighed and leaned back. He gazed the horrible sight over and over again, burning to find something new. Here stood one of the greatest minds in all of Europe, a man who had held the lamp high in a conquest to enlighten the path before humanity and lead them from the dark of superstition and fear to the light of realism and truth. And now, as Strauss gazed him over, all this had shattered. He had designed the finest bridge ever built, but when finally he tried to cross, it gave sudden way and left him tumbling into a deadly chasm, and not a single skilled architect could tell what had gone wrong. Dr. Taylor, you're not going to like this, but I think you'd best get home and get some rest. Think of it like an experiment. Go to bed, wake up, and see if going to bed again in a well rested mood will be easier on you. I should not like to sleep. I only know what that will do to me. I should merely like to be locked in a very secure concrete box. I will. I will get you a secure concrete box. And I appreciate your efforts, good sir. Have a good day, Professor Taylor. Dr. Taylor slapped the door closed behind him. In the silence, Strauss leaned back and sighed loudly. He could not disband the pit that had formed in his stomach. As he leaned back, he almost thought he feared that the chair itself was vanished. He turned around to see the same view of a dirty London street he had always seen. He had even tried biting his finger until tears welled in his eyes, all in a desperate effort to know that he felt something and his finger was not a mere figment. At length he called to his intern, feeling entirely defeated. The damsel poked her fair head through the door. "Yes, Dr. Strauss? Would you would you address me a letter?" "Certainly, sir. To what address?" "Send this one to Hanwell." That is the end of The Nightmare, written and read by me, Joshua Todd Basener. As much as it pains me to be yet another YouTuber who does this, I do ask that you would like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I know you hear it everywhere, but it does help the channel. If you like the sound of my voice and or my piano playing, please do not hesitate to tell me. Comment down below with your thoughts. Above all else, I hope you have a most delightful day.